Hello class, so this lecture is to help you get started with your next writing assignment, which is to produce an essay somewhat like the ones you read for today, in defense of Romeo and Juliet, or a sort of takedown of Romeo and Juliet. Basically, is Romeo and Juliet a good play? You get to answer these questions. And in order to do that, you're going to need to respond to others' ideas and other arguments, which is the kind of interchange, the back and forth that you read with your articles for today. So I'm going to go through the steps that are needed in order to sort of produce this kind of paper. Now, the question of whether or not Romeo and Juliet is a good play is fundamentally a question of evaluation. You're being asked to evaluate something, which is to render some kind of judgment. Now, it's important to distinguish evaluation from other types of response to literature. Not that those other types are unimportant or unnecessary, just that they're different and that sometimes they can be confused. So, an evaluation is not an opinion and it's not a response. So, when you are asked to evaluate something, you are not being asked whether or not you liked it. You are not being asked what you felt about it, either as you were reading it or now that you're looking back on it. Those two things are separate. The question of is it good is different from the question of how you feel about it, whether or not you like it. Everybody can and does both dislike things that are good, happens all the time. I've read many classical works of literature that I have great respect for, but I wouldn't read them again because I did not like them. Also, it's often the case that people like things that aren't great. I'm sure we've all come across, if not books, movies, or television that we know are bad and are fun anyway. So we have to set aside those questions of how we feel about it and be like, okay, is it good or not? And to be able to answer that, since we're not basing it on our feelings and emotions, is that we have to have some kind of external standards of judgment against which we can measure it. So like we can say this is good if it meets these general criteria. So we really have to think about what those are. So in order to decide whether or not Romeo and Juliet is a good play, we have to decide what makes any play a good play. And when you're having an argument with someone else, which is sort of the key element of this paper, you have to have at least some of those standards in common. Otherwise, you're just talking past each other. You know, someone says, well, it's got holes in the plot, but you don't think having a coherent plot matters as to whether it's a good play or not, so you're just going to be talking past each other, and that's going to be unhelpful. So you need to identify your standards of judgment and the standards of judgment that the other person is using in order to ensure that you're sort of playing on the same playing field and not, you know, 2 fields over, for instance. So I think the core standard of evaluation for works of literature and for works of art generally is it true? Now, this is assuming that the point of works of art is to get at something that is true, and something that is true in a way that is outside of us and in a way that is outside of our experience of it. That truth has to be out there in order for this standard of evaluation to make sense. Now, when I say is it true, I don't mean like, is it nonfiction? Because obviously that's going to rule out a whole lot of material. What I mean is, does it reflect something real about the world as it is? Is there some kernel of reality that we can recognize and say, yes, that is true, like that is something that is real, and this author or this artist has managed to present it to us so we can see it in this particular way. There's a certain recognition there. And this can happen in books that aren't realistic
in any way. So, for example, science fiction or fantasy works, obviously not realistic. It's both not true in the sense that it's not history, and it's also not true in the sense that there's a lot of things that don't even exist at all. Like, it couldn't even be true in the universe as it is. But nevertheless, if they're good, they get at some truth about the way the world is structured and about how we interact with it that will resonate deeply with us, and we'll say, yes, that is true, that is right, even though it's not realistic. So reflecting something real and being realistic are not the same thing. And then sort of the next thing you need to consider is, do its elements work together to achieve that image of reality? So in other words, not just does it have a good idea in the center of it, but if a work of art is really good, everything is going to be working together really well and really harmoniously to achieve it. This is where the concept of beauty comes from, right? And harmony among its parts. A good author is going to be using all of the tools available to him or her to achieve this. And we've been talking about this all along, that there's more than one way to sort of get at and think about an idea rather than just having somebody say it, right? You can express it through irony. You can express it through alliteration. You can get at it all kinds of ways. And if it's good, those techniques will be working together. So I suggest you use those as a standard of evaluation. And so you're going to build your argument on the question of, does Romeo and Juliet do this, or does it not do this?
The first step is to read the text, so obviously that's part of your homework, finish reading Romeo and Juliet, and collect the evidence. So these are going to be the reasons for your opinion. Think hard about what is on either side of this question. You can get specific examples from the text. That's one kind of reason or evidence. You can pull from the arguments of others. Obviously the main sources for you would be the articles we read for today. If you want to, you can look around on the internet and see if you can find other similar arguments about whether this is a good or a bad play, and you're welcome to use those as well. And third is your own experience. What did you think reading this play? How does it fit with your own experience of these kind of ideas? Is it helpful? Is it not helpful? So all of these could be seen as evidence to support your opinion about the play. Then, make up your mind. That's what you need to do next. Come down on one side or another. Is Romeo and Juliet a good play, or is Romeo and Juliet a terrible play? Now, you can sort of nuance that a little bit if you want. Like, it's a good play, but there are some parts that are a little hokey, or it's mostly a terrible play, even though it has some great lines. But by and large, you should come down on one side or the other of this question. This, by the way, is a picture, or is a still from the movie I told you about today, that made in the 60s, with a 15-year-old Juliet. So thus far is the winner as far as coming closest to the actual age of Romeo and Juliet. Once you've found your opinion, you know what you think, now it's time to consider the arguments of those on the other side. So collect reasons from written opposing arguments. You should have a pretty good jump start on that today because of what I asked you to do for homework this past week. And then come up with your own opposing arguments. Again, I asked you to come up with one of those. You should be able to imagine yourself on the other side of an argument. This is always a really good way to strengthen any kind of argument you have. Imagine what are the best reasons you could come up with on the other side of this particular debate, and that'll make it even stronger. This picture, by the way, is of the balcony at the Casa di Giulietta in Verona, so the one that they added on later on. It isn't actually original to the house, but that's what it looks like. The next step is to figure out how you will respond to those opposing arguments that you've come up with. Say you've come up with 2, 3, 4, 5 possible objections to your assessment of the play. There are really 3 different ways you can respond to an opposing argument. The first and most obvious way is to rebut it. Basically say, no, that's not true. This is true instead. And of course you'll need to provide evidence for that claim. You can also concede, which is to say, yes, that is true. Usually you then go on to say, yes, that is true, but. So, yes, that is true, but it still works for this reason, for that reason, or like, yeah, that's true, but it still doesn't make the play a bad play overall. It's not that big of a blemish. And finally, and this is somewhat similar to concession, but, a little bit different, it's total dismissal. Just, yes, that's true, but who cares? It's just not that important to your assessment of the play. This picture, by the way, of all these guys in special shirts, is from the modern version of Romeo and Juliet that came out in the 90s. That's a young Leonardo DiCaprio in the middle, and they're clearly in the town of Verona Beach, which you can tell is a party town from their shirts. Okay, so here's how Butler crafts his argument and deals with the opposing article that, in essence, he's responding to. Pretty much the first thing he does is summarize the major arguments of his opponent, announcing that Romeo and Juliet hasn't aged well. Rosenberg writes that it is full of terrible, deeply childish ideas about love, that she doesn't want to see depressing material, that the plotting is sloppy, the world-building vague, and that the play lacks rich roles. Okay, so he lists it all. Notice this is all one sentence, so he doesn't take a ton of time summarizing her stuff. He condenses it all down into one tight little statement. And he also mixes up direct quotations from her original piece alongside some paraphrase and summary of his own. And that's always a good idea when you're dealing a lot with somebody else's writing, to sort of mix up what you do rather than have a ton of quotations or no quotations at all. Okay? And then he counters with his own thesis, right, in which he outlines his main arguments for the fact that Romeo and Juliet is a great play that goes much deeper than the story of lovesick teenagers killing themselves. It's tightly plotted, multi-layered, filled with incredible lines and complicated characters, and far smarter than it often gets credit for on the subject of young love. So he lists all of his major arguments there. Your paper should do the same thing. It should both concisely and fairly summarize major arguments on the other side, and it should have a thesis statement that clearly, concretely lists the reasons for your opinion. And then, now he's going to back up this claim he makes in his thesis with his own evidence. Here's an example of where he uses rebuttal, where he takes a claim from the original article and says, that's just not true. Okay? First, he kind of repeats her claim. Rosenberg complains that the play never explains the inciting incident of the fighting, but that's the whole point. The war has continued for so long that neither the Montagues nor the Capulets seem to know or care why they're fighting. The play would not work if the courtship were a measured adult affair, which is one of the many reasons why the text frequently highlights the absurdity of their romance. So he brings up the original objection, he responds to it and says, no, that's not a legitimate objection because that's not the way the play is supposed to work. And then he notice how he segues from that, he transitions from that into his own point. He's talking about how the text frequently highlights the absurdity of their romance. And he talks about the many jokes that Mercutio makes. So that's what makes this a point-by-point structure, right? He deals with this one complaint, and then he offers another piece of his own evidence. They're kind of mixed together rather than in blocks. Here's an example from his paper of a concession. The actors are, as Rosenberg notes, too old for their roles by at least a decade. But the stage, which requires more engagement of our imaginations than either film or television and lacks close-ups, often cons audiences into leaving their incredulousness at the coat check. So he says, yes, they're ridiculously too old to play Romeo and Juliet, but hey, this is a stage production, maybe it'll work. So he does have some kind of half-hearted or sort of a halfway response to this, but in essence he's conceding, like, yes, these particular actors are too old to play Romeo and Juliet.
Now, here is an example of a dismissal. Yes, the play relies on a series of odd coincidences and near misses that are very old-fashioned, but so do both Breaking Bad and Downton Abbey. Notice that this also begins with a yes. Like concession, dismissal often requires sort of agreeing with or acknowledging the truth in what your opponent has to say. And that happens. It's rare that somebody gets absolutely everything wrong, especially in matters of fact. You're going to have to say, like, yes, that is a true fact. And what makes dismissal a little bit different from concession is that you're not sort of acknowledging a problem. You're just saying, look, that is irrelevant. It doesn't matter to the argument at hand. We should just set that concern aside. Usually that irrelevance comes from those standards of judgment we talked about at the beginning. What he's saying here is, look, you're basing this on the wrong standard of judgment. You're saying that it should be realistic, which the odd coincidences and near misses are definitely not. Like, Romeo and Juliet is not a realistic play, but realisticness is irrelevant for whether or not it's good. So he's dismissing this concern because it's based on an improper principle. So this is probably the best route for handling it if you have a difference, not just in interpretation, but in those fundamental standards of judgment. You have to say, like, look, we just need to set this concern aside because we don't have the same standards of judgment here, and we're not going to be able to argue about it. And he says, look, there are plenty of other things that also have this same thing. Like, realisticness is something we have come to expect in all kinds of art forms, including these modern ones. And that's why it's not a good way to judge the value of something. Now that you have accumulated all of these reasons and all of these ways to respond to somebody else, you need to put it into some kind of coherent form. And like with our last paper, which was a comparison and contrast paper, we have sort of two different sets of information that we're going to be dealing with. So our two basic options for organization are going to be the same as they were last time. We have a block organization or a point-by-point organization. Now, with an evaluation and a response paper like the one we've got here, this is what a block organization would look like. So first, you're going to lay out your arguments. You're going to state your position with your reasons and your supporting evidence. Like, that's going to be your first paragraph or two, is just you making your case, like a lawyer laying out, opening arguments or something like that. Then you're going to summarize that conflicting position, including reason. This is where, say the defense lawyer would lay out their opening arguments or their statement of the case. Then the last part of the paper is going to be you sort of taking those reasons one by one and responding to them in whatever way you see appropriate, rebutting them with evidence, conceding a point, or dismissing a point. And I've included some examples of what each of these, sections of your paper might look like in this chart over here to the left. So that's what a block organization would look like. Now, a point-by-point organization responds to each objection as it arises. So you would still sort of have your own argument in there, but rather than stating the entire objection and then dealing with it all sort of in a chunk, you're going to describe their point and you're going to respond to it right away. And you're probably going to group these by topic, say plot or characters or the understanding of love or something like that. and you're going to include the opposition's points, and you're going to respond to them. Your own arguments or any sort of additional reasons or evidence you have that's not just a response to somebody else, you're going to add on in those same sort of topic-based paragraphs. So that is what a point-by-point organization would look like. And I strongly recommend that you create a really hearty outline of your paper before you start writing it. You should have all of your evidence collected. You should have all of your reasons in place. You should know how you're going to deal with these opposing arguments, and you should start sort of moving them around into paragraphs. You can even switch between the two types of organization and see which one sort of flows more naturally before you start writing, and that's going to make that writing stage a lot easier for you. Now, to recap what you're going to need for the first draft that you're going to turn in this Thursday. First, just as before, you're going to need a good, strong thesis statement. And in this particular case, your thesis statement is going to be your conclusion. Your answer to this question, is Romeo and Juliet a good play? It's not going to be yes or no, obviously. It's going to be a statement that says, here is my evaluation of its quality and the main reasons why. Your first draft will also need to have clearly articulated reasons for that conclusion and the evidence to support those reasons. You cannot just make unfounded assertions, such as the characters are weak. Which characters are weak? What makes them weak? You're going to need the concrete evidence, and it needs to be in your paper, which is why, as I said earlier on, I strongly recommend you collect this evidence before you start writing, rather than writing a draft than trying to hunt for quotations to stick into it later on. You can tell when that's what's been done. So you need to have that. You also need to have that opposition perspective, that the reason somebody might disagree with you, and you need to state those both clearly and reasonably. Not doing a good job of representing an opposing argument is called a straw man fallacy. It's a logical fallacy where you demolish some argument that isn't actually an argument that somebody who disagrees with you would actually make. But it makes, like, look at this. This is just the silliest thing ever. And of course it's easy to knock over because it's made of straw. It's not actually what the other person would say. So that's why that sort of clear, unbiased presentation of somebody else's ideas is important in this kind of paper. And you can do that either through paraphrase, which is of course going to be your only option if it's not an objection that you get from one of the articles that we read, or you can use quotation. Don't overuse quotation. You don't want to give over too much of your paper to someone else's voice. But it is something that you can use occasionally, as we saw in looking at how Butler responded to the article he disagreed with. And finally, it needs to be arranged logically. You need to have chosen one of those organizational systems we went over, and it needs to be in one of those organizational systems to make it easier to understand. And if you want to know why I grade your drafts and what I'm looking for when I grade your drafts, this is it. The things on these lists are what I'm looking for when I assign a grade to your draft. I don't expect a first draft to look like a final draft, but I do expect it to include the things I tell you to include. And if you want to know, like, why did I lose all these points on my draft, it's almost always because it's missing some one or another of these elements. If I tell you to do something and you don't do it, that is a recipe for some missing points. So I just wanted to recap that so we were very clear. Good luck on your drafts. I look forward to reading them.